April 1945. A muddy field hospital set up beside a shattered railway line just east of Aachen. The air smelled of wet wool and antiseptic, and the ground sighed under boots and stretcher poles, while the late winter sun filtered through a thin veil of smoke that made the light taste gray. The war on the Western Front was folding in on itself as supply lines frayed and maps were redrawn, but small violences and bureaucratic orders still shaped days. A transport truck idled at the camp edge, its canvas flap fluttering like a tired flag. From the back, a group of prisoners emerged, motion slow and uncertain, faces half hidden beneath caps and ash. Among them stood a woman who did not look like the others at first glance. She moved with a practiced economy, hands steady as if folding invisible letters, eyes that measured the sky. Private Thomas Reed, 26, lanky and blunt, had never seen a German prisoner who carried herself like an operator rather than a defeated enemy. He watched as she stepped into the marsh of mud and gravel, and the soldier in him cataloged uniform, papers, and the small object caught at the seam of her coat, a worn leather ring. A corporal in charge, William Hayes, barked orders. A sergeant from Ohio, Earl Donovan, passed water in metal cups. When the woman stumbled, Thomas reached out before he thought and steadied her elbow. The touch lasted a breath and felt like a truce. She tried a faint English phrase, then smiled with a mouth that still contained language. The moment was small. It was the sort of ordinary courtesy that, in the wrong hands, could be read as weakness or as a breach. If you are drawn to stories about how ordinary gestures shift the arc of lives in wartime, stay with this one. There are surprises ahead. The truck had come from a temporary holding pen near the railway station, engines still warm. The woman, whose name on a torn tag read Liesel Baumann, had been catalogued as a prisoner of war after the capture of a signal platoon. Her hair had been clipped by necessity, and her hands smelled faintly of solder. Soldiers clustered and watched as the prisoners were led to a registration table under a canvas awning. The first exchanges were terse and practical. "Name?" Lieutenant Henry Walker asked, pen poised. "Date of birth," muttered Nurse Elsa Richter, eyes searching for signs of illness. Liesel answered in a clipped voice and produced a ration card folded into her palm. Thomas stood by the supply crate and felt an odd mixture of boredom and duty. The camp was a new kind of front line, where paper and patience mattered more than artillery. "You will take a blanket and move to the tent with the wounded," Corporal James Carter told the prisoners. "Be careful with the stretchers," Captain Robert Lang added to the medics. Liesel nodded once. A moment later, a younger prisoner, Otto Brenner, coughed, and a medic named Marta Klein bent to check his pulse. "He needs more broth," Marta said. "I will boil some," Nurse Elsa replied. "We have to keep the rations rationed," Lieutenant Walker said with a dry smile. The practical choreography hid a fragile generosity. Later, when Liesel sat on a tangled bundle of blankets, Thomas handed her a tin cup of water. Their first conversation was cautious. "You cold?" he asked. "Not now," she answered in accented English. "Thank you," she said. "Name?" he asked again, softer. "Liesel," she answered. "Thomas," he said. "How were you caught?" he asked. "A patrol," she said. "We lost the road." "You from the city?" he asked. "From a town near Cologne," she replied. In those exchanges, formal categories loosened for a sliver of time, and two names moved from paper into personhood. The processing tent smelled of petro and iodine, and the soft rustle of lists being crossed off. Medical checks were routine but revealing. Nurse Elsa measured temperature. Dr. Samuel Price checked for shrapnel scars, and Lieutenant Walker completed the registration cards. Thomas watched as Liesel allowed a medic to examine a scar near her collarbone. "Funny place," Marta Klein observed, touch careful as if handling a fragile instrument. "It is old," Liesel said. "Short circuit," she added, and gave a small, ironic smile. "You speak English well," Elsa said, eyebrows raised. "Enough," Liesel answered. The camp had a roster of staff who became characters in the living story. Captain Robert Lang oversaw supplies. Corporal James Carter ran the tent assignments. Private Samuel Price maintained a ledger and joked to keep the moods lighter. Pastor Friedrich Vogel came by to offer blankets and a pause of prayer. Lieutenant Walker insisted on orderly records. The conversation between nursing staff, officers, prisoners, and guards grew more textured. "How long before transfer?" Thomas asked Walker. "Could be a few days," Walker answered. "Could be a week." "Do they send them east?" Thomas said, considering distance and the logic of war. "We hold them for interrogation, then the command decides," Walker answered. "Records first," Elsa added. That insistence on record and process softened the unpredictability of human bodies. The tin of rations, the packet of biscuits, the small cup of coffee became currency. At the point when Thomas offered Liesel an extra ration biscuit, there was a short pause in the tent where a dozen people watched the exchange like witnesses to a tiny breach of protocol. If the scene tugged at you, tell us a short memory of a time a small gesture changed how you saw someone. Begin your comment with the words, "The gesture was," so we can read quickly. Sharing these moments helps others see how complex human responses can be and builds conversations about compassion in hard times. Now, back to the story where that biscuit started to mean more than simple food. Days inside the encampment slotted into routines that smelled of coffee, wet canvas, and boiled cabbage. Liesel learned the hours of the infirmary, where rations were counted and where silence was respected for those newly traumatized. Thomas was assigned to night watches and to assisting with deliveries from the kitchen. He taught Liesel how to open a field ration with a can opener that jammed, and she taught him a steady way to knot a mess tin strap. In the evenings, a small circle gathered by a dim lantern and shared songs or news clipped from a tattered newspaper. Names became a web. Otto Brenner whistled old folk tunes. Marta Klein read the labels on tins to anyone who could not. Pastor Friedrich Vogel offered discreet counsel. Captain Robert Lang argued with Lieutenant Walker about the allocation of blankets. Each person carried a story and contributed to a fragile social architecture. As routines built, so did a series of tiny intimacies that made the idea of forbidden feeling plausible. Thomas noticed Liesel watching the way he rolled bandages, the tilt of his shoulders when he loaded a stretcher. Liesel observed the way he listened to others and kept uncomfortable silences. When they shared a cigarette behind the supply tents, there were small confessions. He said he had been a mechanic in Ohio and wanted to study architecture when he returned. She said she had been a radio operator and wanted to finish a course in telegraphy after the curfew. One night, Thomas asked about the leather ring at her coat seam. She pressed it between her fingers and told him it belonged to her brother Hans, who had disappeared when the front moved. The ring was a map to memory and to a loss that could not be simply cataloged. Their conversations lengthened and became braver. In the privacy of the tent, Liesel spoke of a childhood in which letters mattered, of a father who taught her Morse code as if teaching prayer. She described the rhythm of signals and the comfort of patterns. Thomas told a story of a small workshop where his hands had learned the language of spanners and lathe. These were not full backstories yet, but they shaped the ways they leaned in toward each other and toward trust. Liesel had a past that arrived in fragments and in the quiet places of the camp. She had been born in a small house near Cologne, a daughter of a post office clerk and a dressmaker. As a child, she had pressed stamps and learned letters before toys, and had a habit of lining up peas by size when lonely. Her first teacher had been her father, who taught her to read the ticking of clocks and the two-beat pattern of Morse. At 14, she apprenticed at the municipal switchboard and learned to connect voices across the city. The war intruded in measures and ration coupons. Her brother Hans joined the local militia and came home once with mud on his boots and a story about a lost road. Liesel had been too young to protest when the signal unit sought operators, and too determined to refuse when told she had a useful skill. She learned wiring and the smell of solder. She learned to steady her hands while the ground shook. When the platoon was captured, a patrol had mistaken their unit for a retreating column and fired. She had been separated from Hans in the confusion and later found a billet that had been ransacked and a note torn in half. There were nights she kept a single candle and traced the edges of a photograph. The loss shaped her into someone who measured safety in lists and in small, persistent rituals. She could fix a faulty radio and compose a message with a hand that froze only when names of missing people were mentioned. In the camp, she kept a small leather ring that had once been on Han's hand and flicked it when she was thinking. That ring became a way into tenderness because it was almost painfully human and impossible to file under policy. Thomas Reed arrived in Europe as a young mechanic from a small Ohio town where he had been apprenticed to his uncle in a garage. He had grown used to the smell of grease and to the exactness of metal folded to purpose. As a boy, he had learned to read blueprints and to prize things that fit together. He had loved architecture lectures at night school before the draft and imagined simple geometric houses with strong windows. When he enlisted, it was partly a sense of duty and partly a rage about a world that did not keep its promises. In training, he learned to carry a pack as if it was a sculpture and to fold maps by compass points. He had a sister named Mary who wrote letters with lists of chores and small recipes. His mother kept a tin of tea sealed for special occasions. Thomas carried these small domestic reliquaries with him like talismans. In France, he fixed an engine under shelling, and in Belgium, he learned the vocabulary of loss that then arrived at Aachen. He had seen friends go quiet and others go brittle with laughter to keep terror at bay. He kept a notebook with sketches of porches and window frames, a catalog of what normal life might look like again. That notebook came into his pocket the day he studied Liesel because he had thought architecture was about shelter and then realized it could also be about creating a safe room in someone's gaze. His backstory gave him a patient muscle for repair that became emotional as well as technical. He measured risks differently because he had practiced fixing what was broken rather than simply surviving. This made him both tender and stubborn in ways Liesel did not expect. The bond grew, and so did the tensions that watched it. Rules of occupation and suspicion of fraternization were not empty words. A patrol commander, Sergeant Donovan, hinted that too much familiarity invited chaos. Captain Lang warned that any concession could be used as a pretext by higher command. Thomas and Liesel met in small abandoned rooms to trade stories and swapped a cigarette for a scrap of chocolate. In one long exchange, they tried to name what they were becoming. "We cannot be seen," Thomas said quietly, fingers tracing the seam of a tent. "I know," Liesel answered, "but I am tired of being only what they say." "You could be transferred," Thomas said. "Or worse," she answered. "Do you think I do not know the risks?" he said. "You think I would let you go?" she asked, voice barely audible. "I am not a man of many promises," he said, "but I will not leave you alone in the dark." "Why stay?" she asked, "when your life is waiting?" "Because some things are about how you behave when everything else is collapsing," he said. "Because a ring can mean a memory, and I cannot pretend it is nothing. And if they take you away," she said, "and they ask about us, then I will tell a simple truth," he said. "We shared bread." "That will be enough," she replied. The conversation stretched into 8 small shifts of speech and silence. The tent closed around them like a world. Outside, there were other voices. Otto Brenner laughed too loudly down the path. Pastor Friedrich knocked once and left a small loaf on the table. Lieutenant Walker had scheduled extra registrations. The rules pressed into the spaces where tenderness had tried to grow. The first moment of real danger came during an inventory inspection when a supply clerk reported seeing Liesel near the officers' quarters. Rumors bloomed like oil on water, and the camp's guards shifted into a nervous pattern. Captain Lang called a meeting, and the possibility of transfer was raised aloud. "We cannot have fraternization compromising security," Lang stated. "Orders are orders," Sergeant Donovan agreed. Thomas felt the ground of routine crack under his feet. He confronted the accusation with words because he could not yet move to other defenses. "She has done nothing wrong," he said. "She aided our wounded and kept records that helped us locate missing equipments." "Orders must be followed," Walker said. "Show me their records," Lang demanded. There was a loud, breathless pause. Liesel stood and did not plead. Her face was small in the fluorescent glare. She offered to produce the registration cards she had kept and the checksum lists she had helped draw. The papers showed more than duty. They showed a pattern of humanity threaded through chaos. For a stretch of minutes, the command read names and could not deny the care documented by Liesel and by Nurse Elsa. The tension lasted and fit the required measure of dread and moral test. It concluded not with violence, but with a bureaucratic compromise. Liesel would remain under close watch, and the camp would keep detailed logs. The compromise saved them from immediate rupture, but left the rawness that would return. They were later moved to a larger encampment near the river, where the lines between military necessity and human possibility continued to blur. The new location meant better shelter, but also more scrutiny. Allies and opponents multiplied. Lieutenant Walker became an ally by leaning on the side of process and record and producing a paper trail to justify Liesel's presence. Corporal James Carter arranged small tasks that kept her in useful places. Nurse Elsa advocated for legitimate medical reasons to keep certain prisoners nearby. Pastor Friedrich offered moral support and quietly intervened when visits from higher command became intrusive. On the other hand, Sergeant Donovan remained suspicious and reported irregularities in whispered notes. Otto Brenner and Marta Klein became friends who smuggled extra blankets when they could. Captain Robert Lang walked a tight line between duty and compassion. That transfer increased the emotional stakes and presented a new set of risks. Then came the night when a rumor of an approaching inspection by a divisional officer threatened to reveal their closeness. They had to make decisions about what to hide and what to reveal. Thomas and Liesel rehearsed neutral gestures, swapped layers, and practiced smiles for strangers. The encampment itself felt like a theater full of small rehearsals of normality. The climax arrived when division orders required an immediate relocation, and any prisoners deemed a security risk were to be moved further east for detention. The order came like weather. Thomas received the notice, and in the face of it, his decisions narrowed to a single point. He could either follow chain of command and step back, or contravene orders and submit to consequences. They met in the stores room where tin rations hummed and the smell of metal and old coffee made an unlikely sanctuary. "They will move you," he said. "There might be no way to stop them," she answered. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "If I lose my rank and face a court then?" "You cannot throw away your life," she said. "You are the kind of person who fixes things." "I will fix one thing," he said. "I will fix a life." "We could run," she whispered. "I have no passport and no papers that let me cross borders," she added. "You have a home," he said. "I have no home to go back to that is safe," she answered. The dialogue ran in 6 full turns, and their words were a ledger of risk and desire. Outside, the camp reeled with orders and footfalls. Thomas made a decision that would alter both their fates. He forged a note within his influence, a record that declared Liesel a civilian under medical observation due to shock, and thus not an immediate security transfer. The paper was marginal, perhaps legally dubious, but it bought time. Lieutenant Walker agreed to initial cover if Thomas accepted non-judicial punishment. When the command reviewed the documents, they both knew there were consequences. This act sealed a choice that would shape thereafter. The aftermath was a mixture of quiet exultation and practical fallout. Thomas posted his report and surrendered himself to a hearing that landed him a reprimand and delay in promotion. He accepted the administrative consequences without rancor, because the alternative was worse to him. Liesel was moved into a supervised civilian shelter attached to the camp and given official tasks that justified her presence. The community around them rallied in subtle ways. Nurse Elsa smoothed the paperwork, Pastor Friedrich wrote a character note, Marta Klein and Otto Brenner provided small favors. News of Thomas' intervention circulated and divided opinions among the leadership. There were those who praised his humanity and those who considered it imprudent. Captain Robert Lang recorded the incident as a mitigation and saved both from immediate disgrace. Over the next month, Liesel and Thomas learned to live within the parameters they had carved. They walked along the river in small authorized groups and swapped stories about food and places to return to. They worked within the vocabulary of ration, registration, occupation, and evacuation, and found tenderness in the interstices. 1 month later, Liesel taught a small class to young volunteers about basic telegraphy, and in the process, she found purpose beyond the ring she still carried. Thomas continued to repair engines and sketched windows in the margins of a ledger, imagining a house he might someday live in with someone who understood signals. 3 months later, the bureaucratic machinery that had once threatened them produced a transfer that allowed Liesel to work in a municipal communications office under oversight and to exercise her skills legally while the denazification and reorganization made space for civilian reintegration. 6 months later, Thomas took a leave and traveled to the town where Liesel had family, carrying with him a small parcel containing tools and a copy of a newspaper clipping that mentioned reconstruction contracts. They formalized an arrangement that was not yet marriage, but a mutual commitment to build daily life and to answer the question of belonging together in practical terms. Names that had sustained them appeared in records and letters. Pastor Friedrich officiated a small non-ceremonial commitment in a room warmed by a cast-iron stove and witnessed by Nurse Elsa, Corporal James Carter, Marta Klein, and Otto Brenner. The community that once had been a catalog of ranks and duties became a network that supported two people to claim a future. The larger patterns of history had not been overturned. Occupation, registration, rationing, and official denazification continued as processes that shaped many lives. Yet, in one corner of that vast ledger, a different counting occurred. The memory of the leather ring, of the water cup offered in a muddy tent, of the papers Thomas had filed became part of a private archive and a public record. If such stories of human connection in the midst of structural violence matter to you, subscribe and follow for more narratives that pair archival detail with the intimate textures of lived lives. In the end, what lingered was not the order given or the reprimand recorded, but the ordinary gesture that had begun everything. They had learned to repair more than engines. They had learned to repair trust.